The core geographic challenge. China faces a geographic paradox that has shaped its entire history and threatens its future. Despite being the world's most populous nation and second largest economy, China is geographically trapped by a combination of natural barriers, resource scarcity, and strategic vulnerabilities that no amount of economic power can fully overcome. The country's geography creates existential challenges in water security, energy dependence, food production, and territorial defense that will define China's trajectory for decades to come. Geographic isolation creates vulnerability. China is surrounded by some of Earth's most formidable natural barriers. The Himalayas to the southwest create an impassable wall between China and South Asia. The Tibetan Plateau, averaging 4,500 meters elevation, acts as a massive buffer zone but is essentially uninhabitable wasteland. To the west, the Taklamakan and Gobi deserts create barriers as effective as oceans. The north faces the Siberian wilderness and Mongolia's empty steppes. Only the eastern coastline provides accessible geography, but this single opening creates strategic weakness. This geographic isolation meant China developed in relative separation from other civilizations for millennia. While isolation protected China from invasion routes that plagued Europe and the Middle East, it also created a civilization that looked inward rather than outward. The geographic barriers that protected ancient China now trap modern China. The country has limited options for expansion or resource acquisition because nearly every direction is blocked by geography. The population distribution problem. China's 1.4 billion people are not distributed evenly across its vast territory. Approximately 94% of the population lives in eastern China, east of the Heihe-Tengchong line. This invisible line divides China into two radically different geographic zones. Eastern China contains fertile river valleys, accessible coastline, and moderate climate. Western China is mountains, deserts, and plateaus, where human habitation is difficult or impossible. The concentration of population in the east creates enormous pressure on limited resources. Eastern China must support nearly 1.3 billion people on less than half the country's land area. The population density in eastern provinces exceeds 400 people per square kilometer in many areas, comparable to the most crowded parts of Europe. Meanwhile, Western China remains largely empty, not by choice, but because the geography cannot support large populations. Tibet, Xinjiang, and Inner Mongolia combined represent over 50% of China's land, but contain less than 6% of the population. This uneven distribution creates strategic vulnerabilities. China's economic and population centers are concentrated on the eastern coast, exposed to naval blockade. The country cannot redistribute population westward because the geography won't support it. China is geographically locked into a coastal dependency that creates military and economic risk. The water crisis. China faces potentially catastrophic water scarcity that geography created and no engineering can fully solve. Northern China, home to 45% of the population, has only 20% of the country's water resources. The North China Plain produces 50% of China's wheat and 33% of its corn, but is running out of water. Groundwater tables have dropped 300 feet in some areas, as aquifers are depleted faster than rainfall can recharge them. The Yellow River, northern China's lifeline, runs dry before reaching the ocean in many years due to agricultural and industrial demand. The river that built Chinese civilization is literally disappearing. The Yangtze River, China's longest, provides water to southern China but doesn't help the northern regions that need it most. The geographic distribution of water doesn't match the distribution of people and agriculture. China's response has been the South-North Water Transfer Project, one of history's largest engineering projects. The system diverts water from the Yangtze Basin northward through massive canals and tunnels. The project moves 44.8 billion cubic meters of water annually over distances exceeding 1,000 kilometers. Yet even this massive intervention doesn't solve the fundamental problem. Northern China uses more water than geography provides. The water transfer treats symptoms without addressing the geographic cause. Climate change is worsening the water crisis. Glaciers in the Himalayas and Tibetan Plateau feed China's major rivers. These glaciers are melting rapidly, threatening long-term water security. The temporary increase in meltwater will give way to reduced flows as glaciers disappear. China's water supply depends on geographic features actively being destroyed by climate change. Agricultural limitations. China must feed 20% of the world's population with only 7% of the world's arable land. This fundamental geographic constraint shapes everything from domestic policy to foreign relations. China's mountainous, desert, and plateau geography means only about 11% of the country is suitable for agriculture. The agricultural land is concentrated in eastern river valleys and the North China Plain. The limited farmland is under constant pressure from urbanization and development. China loses agricultural land to cities, factories, and infrastructure despite laws protecting farmland. The country must import massive quantities of food to supplement domestic production. China is the world's largest importer of soybeans, corn, and wheat. Food security requires importing resources from other continents. The geographic constraint on agriculture creates strategic vulnerability. Any disruption to global food supplies or trade routes threatens China with famine. The country cannot feed itself from domestic geography alone and never will. China's food dependence gives foreign nations leverage and requires China to secure shipping lanes across oceans it doesn't control. Geography forces China into global dependency despite nationalist aspirations for self-sufficiency. Energy and resource dependence. China's geography is resource poor relative to its enormous population and industrial base. The country has limited oil reserves, insufficient natural gas, and declining coal quality. China consumes more energy than any nation on Earth, but cannot produce it domestically. This creates the mother of all geographic vulnerabilities, energy dependence. China imports over 70% of its oil, most of which travels through the Malacca Strait between Malaysia and Indonesia. This single choke point, controlled by other nations, carries the energy that powers Chinese industry. A blockade of the Malacca Strait would strangle China's economy within weeks. The geographic reality of energy imports traveling through foreign-controlled waters gives adversaries enormous leverage. China's response is the Belt and Road Initiative, attempting to create overland routes for energy imports. Pipelines from Russia and Central Asia reduce dependence on sea routes. Yet these overland routes are slower, more expensive, and still dependent on foreign nations. Geography means China cannot escape energy dependence. The resources simply don't exist within Chinese territory in quantities needed. The Tibet and Xinjiang problem. Western China presents geographic challenges that create ongoing security concerns. Tibet and Xinjiang are massive territories, together larger than Western Europe, that China controls but struggles to integrate. The region's geography makes them naturally separate from China proper. Tibet sits on the Tibetan Plateau, the roof of the world, with average elevations over 4,500 meters. The extreme altitude, harsh climate, and distance from eastern China make Tibet difficult to administer and develop. The plateau is strategically vital because it's the water source for rivers feeding over 2 billion people across Asia. China cannot allow Tibet independence because losing control of Asia's water tower would be catastrophic. Xinjiang is Central Asian desert and mountains, geographically more connected to Central Asia than to China. The region is separated from eastern China by some of Earth's most inhospitable terrain. Xinjiang contains China's largest oil and gas reserves, making it economically vital despite geographic remoteness. The region also provides land access to Central Asia and Europe. Both regions have populations ethnically and culturally distinct from Han Chinese. Geography created this diversity. The mountains and deserts isolated these regions, allowing different peoples to develop. Now China attempts to integrate regions that geography made separate. The cost of controlling these vast, inhospitable territories is enormous, but the strategic cost of losing them would be greater. The coastline vulnerability. China's eastern coastline is simultaneously its greatest asset and greatest vulnerability. The coast provides access to global trade and ocean resources. China's economic miracle occurred in coastal cities that could engage in maritime commerce. Yet this same coastline is China's soft underbelly, exposed to naval blockade. China's coastline is contained by the first island chain, Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, and Indonesia. These islands create a natural barrier between China and the open Pacific Ocean. China's navy must pass through choke points controlled by other nations to reach international waters. The South China Sea is constrained by narrow straits easily blockaded. Geographic reality means China's naval forces can be bottled up close to shore. This explains China's aggressive stance in the South China Sea and regarding Taiwan. Taiwan's position in the first island chain makes it strategically vital. If Taiwan were hostile or controlled by an adversary, it would be a dagger pointed at China's coast. China's claims to South China Sea features attempt to push the defensive perimeter farther from the coast. The territorial disputes are fundamentally about overcoming geographic containment. The aging population multiplier. China's demographic collapse will interact with geographic problems to create compounding challenges. The country's working-age population peaked in 2015 and is declining. By 2050, China will have more retirees than workers. An aging population means fewer people available to overcome geographic challenges through labor and innovation. The demographic decline hits hardest in rural areas where young people migrate to cities. This leaves agricultural regions with aging populations less able to maintain food production. The labor shortage will make resource extraction more expensive. China will have fewer workers to man factories, maintain infrastructure, and staff the military precisely when geographic challenges intensify. Geography and demography combine to create a closing window. China must secure resources, develop Western regions, and solve water scarcity before the working-age population collapses. The timeline is short, and the challenges are enormous. Geography created problems that required massive labor to address, but that labor is disappearing. Climate change amplifies every challenge. Climate change is worsening every aspect of China's geographic problems. Rising temperatures are melting glaciers that feed China's rivers. Changing precipitation patterns are making droughts more severe in the north and floods worse in the south. Sea level rise threatens coastal cities where economic activity concentrates. The geographic impacts of climate change will be severe across China. Northern China faces increasing desertification as water becomes scarcer. The Gobi Desert is expanding southward into agricultural areas. Southern China faces more intense typhoons and flooding. The coastline's low-lying areas will require massive investments in seawalls and flood control. Climate change doesn't create new problems. It accelerates existing geographic challenges that China already struggles to manage. Water scarcity becomes water crisis. Agricultural pressure becomes food insecurity. The geographic constraints that define China are tightening. Why geography defeats ambition? China's leaders understand these geographic constraints and have tried everything to overcome them. The Belt and Road Initiative attempts to create land routes, avoiding vulnerable sea lanes. The South-North Water Transfer Project moves water across geography. Massive infrastructure connects western regions to the east. Military modernization attempts to break through the first island chain. Yet geography remains ultimately undefeatable. You cannot create arable land where mountains exist. You cannot manufacture water in regions where climate doesn't provide it. You cannot eliminate the strategic vulnerability of resource dependence through infrastructure alone. China can mitigate geographic problems but cannot eliminate them. The geography problem explains why China acts as it does internationally. The aggressive posture in the South China Sea, the Belt and Road Initiative, the focus on Taiwan, the control of Tibet and Xinjiang, all respond to geographic constraints that threaten Chinese security and prosperity. Understanding China's geography problem is understanding why China behaves as it does on the world stage. The inescapable conclusion. China's geography creates a set of interlocking problems with no permanent solutions. Water scarcity, food dependence, energy imports, demographic decline, and strategic containment combine to create challenges that will define China's trajectory. The country can manage these problems in the short term through massive investments and authoritarian control, but cannot eliminate them. Geography has given China a limited window to secure resources, develop alternatives, and achieve strategic objectives before demographic decline reduces capacity for action. The next 2 decades will determine whether China overcomes its geographic constraints or becomes trapped by them. The Belt and Road Initiative, the push for energy independence, and the focus on technological advancement are all attempts to transcend geography's limits before time runs out. China's rise has been remarkable, but geography suggests limits to how far that rise can go. The same geographic isolation that protected China and allowed its civilization to flourish for millennia now constrains its ability to dominate globally. China faces a fundamental geographic problem. It is simultaneously too large to manage efficiently and too constrained by natural barriers to expand influence without enormous cost. This geographic paradox will shape China's future more than any policy decision or technological advancement. Geography has always been China's greatest challenge, and despite everything that has changed, geography remains undefeated. Did this explanation change how you see China? Drop a comment and subscribe for more geopolitical geographic analysis.